Marcy Ekanayake-Weber from the Interdepartmental Doctoral Program in Anthropological Sciences will talk about computer simulations show how to avoid food fights.
So here's a question. Why have the last 2 years been so hard? Of course, there are many reasons, but one is that we rely on each other so much for our mental and physical well-being. We may take this for granted, but this dependence on groups and social relationships has actually baffled the people who study the behavior of our closest relatives, monkeys. Although most monkeys live in groups, this seems to cause a lot of fighting over food or food fights. And scientists have assumed that this means that too many monkeys can't really get along in the same group, or they shouldn't really form groups at all. Basically, if there are more mouths to feed, everybody gets a smaller piece of a pie. So why would you stay together? Unfortunately, this kind of implies that humanity is doomed to constant squabbling because of how social we are. Well, hold on. It may not actually be the case that group living means that we get less food and we're always fighting. In fact, the type of habitat that you live in and the type of food that you eat may have a lot to do with whether living in a group is a good idea or a bad idea. For example, like on the left, do you live in a dense rainforest with food everywhere year round? Or are you scavenging across a dry savanna for whatever you can find, like the picture on the right? Although these differences may seem really obvious, it's actually been difficult to contrast them because there are always multiple factors going on at a time and interacting. So that's where I come in. I said, why don't we use computer simulations to try to pull apart these different factors that are impacting group living? On the computer, I create something a little bit like a video game where I have virtual landscapes and little virtual monkeys who run around looking for food and interacting according to the rules that I give them. Then I can vary both the habitat and the way that they interact to see how this affects how much food they get and how many food fights they get into. What I found so far is that living in a group does not necessarily mean getting less food. Being more friendly did, but this really depended on what the habitat looked like. Moreover, being in a bigger group does not mean getting less food than being in a smaller group. And how the food is divided up within the group, either equally or unequally, is totally dependent on what the habitat looks like. What this means is that food fights are not inevitable, and sharing and getting along might actually be easier than a lot of people have assumed for a long time. And so maybe it's not so surprising that we rely on each other the way that we do.